Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this event that has been organized by the York Festival of Ideas. Today, we are going to hear from Zeinab Badawi, who is going to speak to us about her book, An African History of Africa. But before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to briefly introduce myself because I'm going to be the chair for this event. My name is Joseph Mujere. I'm a historian of Africa, based in the Department of History here at the University of York. I do research on migration and the politics of belonging, as well as mining society and the environment. I also have an interest in filmmaking, documentary filmmaking, to be more specific. So before I introduce our speaker, just a few technical issues. Subtitles for this talk are going to be available, so you can turn up these on the CC show captions button at the bottom of your screen. And should you have any technical issues such as loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link that has been shared with you. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen, and this is available throughout the event, so questions can be posted at any time. Please do remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch this again at your convenient time. So without wasting much of your time, let me introduce to you our speaker today. Our speaker today is going to be Zeinab Badawi, as I've said, who is an award-winning broadcaster, a journalist, a filmmaker. I'm also an aspiring filmmaker, so yeah, I'm going to learn a lot from her as she speaks today. She is the president of the SOAS, University of London, UK, and is an honorary fellow of her alma mater, St. Hilda's College, Oxford, UK. She was born in Sudan, and she has worked in the British media for several decades. Zeinab is a recipient of the President's Medal of the British Academy and the patron of the United Nations Association, UK, and is on boards of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, MINDS, that is the Mandela Institute for Development Studies, the International Crisis Group, Afrobarometer, among other many organizations that she is involved in. She was previously chair of the Royal African Society. I can go on and on about her very long CV. But without wasting much of your time, let me give this platform to Zeinab to speak to us. Thank you, Zeinab.
Thank you so much indeed, Joseph. Hello to you, all your colleagues at York University, and everybody listening to this session in the York Festival of Ideas. Indeed, our roles are a little bit reversed, Joseph, because you are a proper historian who turns his hand to filmmaking and documentaries, and I'm somebody who has been making films, working in the British media, and I'm turning my hand to writing a book about history. So there we are. It's upside down. So the reason I wanted to write a book about history is because, having worked in the media for 4 decades now, as you say, I was born in the Sudan, but I've actually lived in England since I was an infant, since I was 2 years of age. And I have always had, obviously, as a result of where I was born, an interest in Africa. And it always puzzled me in the media as to why there was, the kind of way Africa is depicted in the media, the coup, the war, the famine syndrome. We all know that. And I thought, what can we do to correct this in the media? So there were various ways we could look at, stories which challenge the stereotypes. But then I thought, actually, do you know what? African history is also subject to the same kind of stereotypical, myopic lens. And I thought to myself, I'd rather do something about that, because I don't believe you can change perceptions of Africa today if you don't reach out into Africa's history and try to present a different face, a surprising, revelatory face of African history. So that is why I wanted to look at history, because I think history not only explains the past, but it also informs the present and it helps shape the future. And I also think that history doesn't just narrate the past. I also felt, in terms of Africa's history, that it should also provide a history of hope. So that was the reason why I wanted to look at African history. Why did I decide to call my book An African History of Africa? The subtitle is From the Dawn of Humanity to the Modern Era, to Independence. I had read books about Africa, many good ones, giving a kind of, general overview. And I can name one, for example, A History of Africa by Dr. Kevin Shillington, a friend of mine and somebody I admire. But what I thought was lacking was an overview of the continent from the beginning of time to the modern era, written in a very simple, accessible manner, because having worked in the media for so many years, we do write very simply for television. And that's something I brought to the book, because obviously in television and in films, you don't have the luxury of going back and thinking, hang on, what did that person say? So I wanted to write something that wasn't written in a dense way. But more importantly, I wanted to write a history of Africa based on Africans' scholarship. Because although the Africanists, that is, the Western Europeans, other nationalities who've worked on African history, do a very good job often, I felt that I wanted to include the African scholar, the African historian, archaeologist, paleontologist, and use their perspectives and their work in the book. And that is why it's called An African History of Africa. So they were the reasons why I wanted to bring this account. Why did I start writing the book? Well, the book really grew out of a TV series that I made called The History of Africa with Zeinab Badawi. And that's available on BBC YouTube, free of charge, 20 45-minute episodes. And over the best part of about 7 years, I traveled to more than 30 African countries, about 34. And I made my films and put them out. And then I was troubled by something. I had a niggling thought all the time. And that was this. Everywhere I went in these countries, I traveled across, vast countries like Algeria, the DRC, and I met some of the finest minds you would wish to encounter, African historians, but also cultural experts, also ordinary citizens, museum curators, directors. And they were all so enthusiastic about talking to me that I literally would have to tear myself away from them on each occasion. And when it came to putting the films together, I thought, you know what? So much of what they told me has hit the cutting room floor. I haven't done justice to them. And so I thought to myself, let me incorporate what they told me into a book about African history to give them credit, to try and, ventilate their work in a wider way, more than I could just in, a series of 45-minute films. So that was the genesis of why I wanted to write this book. In a way, it found me rather than me finding it. And I had 3 objectives with the book, which is, I believe if you read it, you will have a much better understanding of Africa's history. Hopefully you'll be stimulated into wanting to learn more about the particular aspects that you find interesting. And I also wanted to hopefully inform and sometimes even entertain you. So they were my objectives in actually, wanting to bring this into the public domain. I've developed a party trick now, which is I say to people, name me an African king or queen. And they almost invariably stop and think, and then they come up with, Tutankhamun. And then they stop and think and then say, but were the ancient Egyptians actually African? And that told me, or it tells me, two things, which is the ignorance about African history, number one, and number two, this idea that Africans have to look a certain way or behave a certain way or have certain names and so on. When people ask why were the ancient Egyptians actually African, it makes me think that we need to redefine what we mean by African. It's the most diverse continent in the world. It's, racially diverse. People who live in the part of Africa that has a Mediterranean coast will inevitably over the centuries have been influenced by Western Asia and the Southern Mediterranean, just as those who live on the east of Africa, influenced by people from Arabia across the Red Sea. It's a very rich melange. So I want to tackle this ignorance about Africa, which sadly also exists on the continent itself, because I talked to many young people in particular, and what they knew about Africa's pre-colonial history was really very, very little. And I think that this is something which has proved remarkably persistent, that people's knowledge of pre-colonial Africa is scant. And I mean, nobody would really express themselves in the way that the late Oxford historian Hugh Trevor Roper would have, who in 1963, in his book, The Rise of Christian Europe, said, there's no history in Africa before the arrival of the Europeans. It's just, there was only darkness, he said, and darkness is not a topic for study. And nobody put it in such a blunt way today, but I do think that Africa's pre-colonial history has been rather eclipsed with the great, great emphasis that's been put on its colonial and post-colonial and, independence history. So, a lot of people would have a relatively good idea about the transatlantic slave trade. They might know about the Berlin Conference of 1885 that divided Africa between major European powers. They'll know about the fight for independence in the 20th century, but very few know much about Africa before the arrival of the Europeans. So I set my book from the origins of humankind, and I don't, in fact, even get to the transatlantic slave trade until chapter 14, and there are 18 chapters in the book, because I really wanted to shine a light on Africa's history before Europeans arrived on the scene. And I also wanted to focus on personalities, because I think history is best understood if it's seared into the imagination, and that's best done through relaying history through characters. Why did I start it? And I will tell you what's in the book in a moment, but I'm just giving you the kind of ideas and the genesis behind it. Why did I start it with the origins of humankind, which strictly speaking isn't the history of Africa, because that is where human beings originated, regardless of where you come from today. I wanted to start it there because, as I say in my book, everybody is originally from Africa. If you're not African or of African descent, you are still originally an African. Nobody on earth today can not say that Africa is their mother continent. The science is settled. Africa is where the human story began. It is where we, Homo sapiens sapiens, that is modern humans, originated. And I wanted to start it there to emphasize our common origins, to try and just express, our common humanity in a world which is very polarized, is divided, there's racism still in, all over the world. I just thought to myself, let's go back and say, look, even blue-eyed, flaxen-haired people with pale complexions still came out of Africa. And that's why I took it back there. And in that first chapter, I explain how we evolved in Africa and how modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, wise and thinking man, human, we were developed by about 100,000 years ago. By about 90,000 years ago, we had populated the whole of the continent. There's still a little bit of a debate about which part of the continent we originated from, with the east and the north being the ones which seem to have most pieces of the jigsaw that are missing. Because it's a very, we don't know exactly, how it all happened. It's like a big jigsaw puzzle with 500 pieces, and we perhaps have as many as 50. So there's a great deal that we are still learning through archaeology and paleontology and so on. But in any case, by about 90,000 years ago, we had populated the whole of Africa. We were about 1 million people by then, living in communities of about 150. Between 60 to 90,000 years ago, the first pioneers left Africa and went in the first instance to Arabia and then Europe and Asia. And there they met other hominins like Denisovans, Neanderthals, and they mated with them, and they were bred into extinction so that only Homo sapiens sapiens, that's us, survived to this day, which is why you still find Eurasians may still have residual DNA traces of Neanderthal and Denisovan and other hominins. So that is our human story. And between 8 to 12,000 years ago, everybody was dark-skinned. A lot of people find that quite surprising, but I based a lot of chapter 1 on the work of my late great friend, Dr. Richard Leakey, the Kenyan paleontologist. And so his work informs a lot of my first chapter, in fact, the whole Leakey family. And I think a lot of people would find that quite surprising, that racial differentiation really only began as recently as that. So anyway, in that first chapter, that's what I look at and what makes us human, the making art for the sake of art, the kind of traditional beliefs that we would have had, and so on. And then I just really look at the civilizations of ancient Egypt, ancient Sudan, and I place ancient Egypt very firmly within Africa. And what I do at the beginning of each chapter is I try to engage in a topic which is being discussed today. So, for example, in the ancient Egyptian chapter, I will look at the debate that has been going on, that's been raging. We saw the controversy last year when the British dual heritage actress Adele James was cast as Cleopatra, and it created a bit of a furor in Egypt because people said, Cleopatra was of Greek Macedonian descent. You can't have somebody of mixed heritage depicting her. And that gave rise to a lot of conversations. And it goes to the heart of, as I said, what do we think of an African when we say who is an African? So I try with each chapter to look at a modern issue, the transatlantic slave trade. I will look at reparations, I also look at restitution, but then look at the history of the particular region that I'm using to illustrate that point. So with the restitution debate, for example, about whether we should return African art, I look at the Benin bronzes as one of the best examples of that, because a lot of the conversation has been around the Benin bronzes, that beautiful bust of Queen Idia of Benin that's at the British Museum. So I look at that controversy before I then go into the history of Benin. So that was my approach in the book. I also try to put the spotlight on topics which are quite uncomfortable and which perhaps haven't received a great deal of attention. For example, the Eastern slave trade, and that is the trade in enslaved Africans that was perpetrated by the Arabs and their partners in Africa. And I explain how that in fact lasted a lot longer than the transatlantic slave trade. It began around the 7th, 8th century and ended in the 19th century. It accounted for about 14 enslaved Africans. They went either mostly across the Indian Ocean, about 10 million. Some went across the Red Sea to Arabia, and the others went up north to the Arab families in the north of Africa, which of course fell to the Arab conquest. So that is a trade which is really not looked at. It's not particularly debated even in the Arab world. And I think that it's healthy to have a discussion about that aspect of African enslavement. I also wanted to focus very much on women, to try to feminize history where I could, because I think people take the HIS in history a bit too seriously and make it his story. So where I could, I would try to tell the history that I was looking at through women. So I mentioned Queen Adia in the Benin chapter, but I also, for example, looked at Ya Asantewaa, who was a wonderful woman who was born in 1840 and died in 1921. She was from the Asante people, sometimes called the Ashanti, and she was a great Asante queen. And when the British were, seeking to conquer the land of the Asante people, the men were kind of half giving up, and Ya Asantewaa said to them, "You cowards, why will the men of Asante land not fight? And if you won't fight, then I'm going to get the women to fight. You should swap your loincloths for my undergarments," she said. She was a very feisty woman, and she was in her 60s, which at that time would have meant she was quite elderly, but full of energy. So in the end, the men heeded her cry, and she had an army of about 20,000, and they fought the British for 7 long months and really inflicted a lot of, pain on them. They were eventually defeated because of the superior firepower in 1900 by the British. But Ya Asantewaa, has gone down in Ghanaian history because, of course, Asante land is in modern day Ghana. And she's become an icon, not only for the people of Asante, but right across the country. And when the country gained its independence in 1957, Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of an independent Ghana, it was formerly called the Gold Coast, that was in 1957, made Ya Asantewaa, a kind of national heroine, and her face would appear on postage stamps. There was a school set up in her name, and, and all the rest of it. So, I try to look at women characters where I can, and there are plenty of examples like Ya Asantewaa. I'm often asked which aspect of the book, of the history, I found most interesting. And I would have to say, having been born in northern Sudan, I did find it quite fascinating, and that's chapter 3, to go to Sudan. I focused on ancient Sudan's history in the north in the 7th and 8th centuries BCE, before Common Era. And that was the Kingdom of Kush. Now, Kush in its earliest iteration, about 2500 BCE, predates ancient Greece and Rome. And I saw some of the edifices, which, really super high, like 3-story, 4-story buildings called dafufas in northern Sudan, and some of the burial mounds and some of the pottery that arose from this period of ancient Sudan's history is known as Kerma. And very little known about it outside of the Sudan, and it was really an amazing civilization. And the Sudanese archaeologist, Dr. Shadia Taha, who's now at Cambridge University teaching there, explained to me and said that actually there's very strong evidence that, for example, the enameling of pottery originated there. And that's something we very much associate with the Greeks and the ancient Egyptians and so on, and possibly even the dyeing of material may have originated there. I look in particular at the 7th, 8th century BCE on the kings of Kush, when they governed Egypt for the best part of a century. And not only did they do that, but they were also superpowers. One of their kings, Shabaka, and his successor, Shabitku, were the protectors of rulers in what we would call the Middle East today, the princes of Byblos and Phoenicia in modern-day Lebanon, King Hezekiah of Judah, and they fought the Assyrians, who were the most warlike army in that particular period of ancient history. We're talking about the 8th, 7th centuries. And, they fought the Assyrians. They really defeated them on numerous occasions. They were brilliant horsemen and archers. They had a very special way of pulling their archers, and they would just aim for somebody's eye and blind the person. Really, really brilliant. And, they were an African superpower, and people don't know about that. And I find that story interesting because it shows you not only the level of ignorance, but also how kingdoms rise and fall. So when you look at Sudan today and the terrible conflict that's going on, it's hard to believe that there was this great civilization. There are 1,000 pyramids in northern Sudan. About 300 preserve their superstructure. They're not as big as the ones at Giza. There are about 100 pyramids in Egypt, not all as big as the Great Pyramids, but that's about the comparison. Temples with beautiful reliefs, the exquisite jewelry, the statues, so much going on there. And as I say, it's been completely overlooked by its more glittering neighbor to the north. I also, let me focus also a little bit on one of them, the most famous king of the Mali Empire. Now, the Mali Empire, which is in West Africa, and it incorporates parts of modern day Mali and also other parts like bits of Mauritania and quite a few countries, Guinea and so on, would have formed the old Mali Empire. But it was established in 1235 by Sundiata Keita. And Sundiata Keita was this, great fighter, a soldier. But he was also very, very magnanimous, because in 1236, Sundiata Keita set up something called the Mandi Charter. Now, the Mandi are the people, his community. Were the Mandi people, sometimes referred to as the Malinki or the Mandingo people, but the charter is known as the Mandi Charter. And it said that all the citizens of the Mali Empire should enjoy liberty, dignity, and equality. 1235, you think of the French Revolution, liberté, fraternité, égalité, liberty, fraternity, and equality in 1789, so many centuries later. Yet here you had an African king in West Africa with the Mandi Charter. It wasn't written, it was oral tradition, but there were lots of Arab scholars who, were chronicling what was going on at that time. And so we know that that was its date. And in fact, UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, quite recently made it part of the world's intangible heritage. It was so significant. So Mansa Musa was the name of the king of the Kingdom of Mali. It was the name the title that they gave to the king. So Musa was his name. Mansa Musa was the nephew of Sundiata Keita, the founder of the Mali Empire. And he was born in 1280. And he died in 1332. But in 1324 to 25, he embarked on a pilgrimage to Mecca, because soon after the establishment of the Mali Empire, the kings became Muslims. There were already Arabs and Muslims, living in that part of Africa. They'd become Muslim, much earlier on. So Mansa Musa, as a Muslim, went to Mecca. And he left with an amazing, amazing retinue. There were 12,000 members of his household. There were 600 personal servants, 60,000 porters, 100 camels bearing between 10 to 20 tons of gold in total, because Mansa Musa was such a rich man, because the Mali Empire was fabulously wealthy through trade, the Trans-Sahara trade, and also the gold mines. On his way back from Cairo, he spent so much money, he and his retinue, and gave away so much gold and spent so much that the price of gold plunged by 25% for more than a decade. Price of gold went down by a quarter globally, I'm talking about, and didn't recover to its previous value for, as I said, more than 10 years. Now, why I like that story too is because it shows you at a time when countries like England, Europe were being plagued by the Black Death, literally the plague. There was Mansa Musa, clad in silk, wearing a golden crown, carrying his golden staff and so on. A figure, a global figure in the world. I mean, so much so that a Catalan cartographer in 1375 drew a sort of picture of the map, a map of the world, and focused on, China and Europe and a little bit. And there was Mansa Musa featuring very, very prominently. And what that tells you is that this idea that there are those who make history and those who sit on the sidelines of history, i.e. Africans, it's just not borne out, as Mansa Musa demonstrates. The activities of this man, of this empire, actually showed how Africa was integrated into the global economy. And in fact, Mansa Musa has the privilege, let's say, of being the richest individual to have ever lived in history. By today's standards, very reliable estimates, as relayed to me by Dulai Konate, the wonderful professor I met at the University of Bamako in Mali, that he said would be quite credible that his worth today would be about 430 billion US dollars. 430 billion US dollars. So quite an accolade. So, it's, I'm trying to, where I can, to bust myths that pre-colonial Africa didn't have history, as Hugh Trevor Roper said, just darkness. And I think that's very important because it's kind of inverting the telescope a bit. And that helps us when we look at Africa's history today to say, actually, it's not all just, a continent that's going to rack and ruin. And I think history is also very helpful to us when we look at Africa today. And I do in my epilogue, because when you think of history, there's the long lens of history. And if you look at Africa today, in the short term, you probably will have quite a lot of cause for pessimism because, we've had a spate of coups, we've got the terrible conflicts raging like the one in the Sudan that I mentioned, Ethiopia has undergone a very, very vicious time, et cetera, et cetera. But if you take the long-term view, I think you have cause to be very optimistic about Africa. And by long term, in some cases, it could be as little as 20 to 25 years. And I say that because Africa has suffered from the colonial legacy, undoubtedly. It's, the international economic order is loaded against Africa. It's been a producer of raw materials for the most part, can't add value to them. So, you have anomalies like countries that are massive oil producers have to spend masses on importing refined oil, petrol to keep going, produce tons of tomatoes and yet import tons of tomato puree from Italy or whatever. So Africa hasn't been going up the value chain, and that has left its economies monocultures, which hasn't really helped them industrialize. And by industrialize, I don't just mean have an industry, I mean to modernize their entire economies. So today you have, regrettable figures such as 640 million people in Africa don't have access to electricity, and so on and so forth. But I base my optimism for Africa essentially on the fact that its people are very young, although ironically, it's the continent which has the oldest history in the world because it's where we originated. It is the youngest in another sense because its people are so young. If you just look at the figures, the average age in Africa is about 18 or 19. In some countries like Chad, it's even 15, in Guinea, 15 as well. Very, very young. If you look at the rest of the world, Japan, 49, Italy, 47, France, 42, France, 42, the UK, 41, or it might be the other way around. The US and China, 38. Africa is very, very young. And we all know from our interactions with young people or our memories when we ourselves were indeed young, youth brings vigor, brings energy, brings ambition. And, by 2050, when Africa's population is projected to have doubled, it's about 1.4 now. It means that a quarter of the world's workforce, its consumers, its producers, are going to be African. And that's where the vigor of the world is. As populations age elsewhere, Africans on the continent and also in the diaspora are going to be really where it's at because of their young people. But also another reason is that Africa has a third of the world's mineral reserves, minerals which are needed for our technological revolutions, for our green revolution and all the rest of it, cobalt, bauxite, lithium. If you take the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for instance, it accounts for about a third of the world's mining in cobalt, which of course is a very important component in electric cars. And Africans are becoming a bit more wise to not being ripped off, basically, by, external interests. And the DRC, for instance, has been reviewing all its mining contracts with its foreign partners to try and make sure that actually any developments do, redound to the benefit of the country. Whether that wealth will be distributed in an equitable way is another matter, because Africa has lacked good governance. Namibia has also banned any exports of raw lithium, saying that it wants to process it so it can get a bit more value for them. So Africans are becoming a lot wiser, that they hold an ace in their hand, an ace because countries all over the world need the minerals that they have. And we know about the gold and the platinum and so on. And, they're all worried about China having all these minerals. And so they want to make sure they can source them from countries which are more friendly, as it were. So for those reasons, I am optimistic about Africa. And that's where I say that, just because Africans in some cases are having a bit of a hard time, we've seen how in the past Africans, lived in a prosperous way, and that it wasn't always so, and it needn't always be so, and it won't always be so. And I think the last thing I want to say before I go to questions is that the book is intended for everybody, because I said everybody is African, but I do think that people who are African or of African descent, I hope they will take away in particular from the book the fact that they can, hold their heads high and bask in the pride of the achievements of the entire continent. I don't like the division between, sub-Saharan Africa and the so-called Arab North. I come from a country which, my mother tongue is Arabic. We straddle both. So I think one takes the continent as a whole. And I just finished with the words of a wonderful woman who I had the privilege of meeting on several occasions, the Kenyan environmentalist Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. And she sadly died in 2011. But she was an environmentalist who planted trees and so on, and, was very visionary. And something she says has always stuck in my head, which is, you cannot enslave a mind that knows itself, that understands itself, that values itself. And that's something that I've always carried with me. And I would say that it was very much an inspiration for me when I was writing this book. So thank you, Joseph. I think I've spoken for my allotted 40 minutes and an opportunity to have some questions, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zeinab. Well, this is really, really fascinating talk. some commentator described your book as a tour de force, and I'm more inclined to agreeing with them that really it's really a tour de force. I mean, from Australopithecus Lucy and the town baby, the town boy, to the most contemporary stuff. I mean, this is really fascinating. We have a number of questions from the chat, and perhaps I can give you 3 at a time. If you're okay with that. The first one, what needs to be done to encourage more African governments to invest in archaeology and historical research? And the second one, what did you find doing your research for this book, which most surprised you or disturbed you? What most surprised you or disturbed you?
Right.
And someone said, I believe you stated that racial inequality or racial division started very recently. Did racial inequality start centuries ago, or has it always been there? Let's start with those 3 questions.
Yeah, I mean, the first one on archaeology. I quoted extensively from the work of Dr. Weber Ndoro, who's a marvelous Zimbabwean archaeologist, who has taught many archaeologists and inspired many right across the continent. And he, laments the fact that there are very few resources being put into archaeology. I mean, I can see it's tough for governments, they've got limited funds and so on. And he says this, but archaeology really has very, very little investment in it today in Africa. And it's a great shame, of course, because, heritage is critically important. And you'll find that there's a handful. I mean, of all the marvelous sites in Zimbabwe, including Great Zimbabwe, amazing. It's the biggest stone complex structure, biggest outside the pyramids of Egypt in the whole of Africa. And, there are other amazing stone settlements in Zimbabwe, and they have literally a handful of archaeologists. And it's the same, I went to so many museums in Africa, and, the displays in many cases were not really very, very good. Sometimes even artifacts have fallen over, although there are not many artifacts. This is a very sore point because a study by the French government, commissioned by the French government in 2018, found that at least 90% of African art objects and treasures and so on are held outside of the continent. So that's a different problem. But yes, I don't know what we do except to try and really be advocates for the importance of history in nation building, in creating greater national cohesion, in African countries want tourism because it's a very important source of foreign currency revenue. So I would just say, really, what we can do is through advocacy. I think you asked, what did I find?
What surprised you or disturbed you during your research for this book?
So, I mean, what surprised me? I suppose the level of the lack of knowledge about Africa's history, pre-colonial era. One former African president said to me, you know what, Zeinab? I could give you the names of English medieval kings better than I could African kings and queens. And it's not just kings and queens who build societies, people do as well. Even my own mother, who's an educated woman, when I said to her, what do you know about the pyramids of Sudan? She says, we went to see them once, but she couldn't give me a date as to when they were built or anything about the kings and queens who were buried and next to them. The ancient Sudanese didn't bury their dead inside pyramids like the Egyptians did. They buried them in tombs adjacent to them. So, that I found extremely surprising. Disturbing may be too strong a word, but certainly I was perturbed by it. And that's why I wanted to write something that was very popular. And, the professional historians like you, Joseph, might say, oh, my goodness, that's not an academic book at all. But I didn't set out to do that. But what I also found very surprising was how history cannot be consigned to the past. So going back again to the ancient Sudanese, the Kushites, from where my family come from, the ancient the Kushites considered it an abomination to eat fish. Imagine they've got the River Nile, well, the two Niles, of course, the Blue and the White Nile meet in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, and then continue as the Nile up to Egypt. So the ancient Sudanese in the north had this amazing source of protein, but they never touched fish. They thought perhaps because of its rotting qualities or whatever. And to this day, the Sudanese consume the least amount, the smallest amount of fish than anywhere in the world. It's about 1 kilogram per person on average per year, compared to, say, Egypt of 25 kilograms per year. Huge difference. My own brother can't stand fish. And I now say to him, it's your genetic memory at play. It shows you how that, hundreds and hundreds of years, centuries and centuries, this has still persisted. And there are many other examples like that. So I found that very surprising. Racial inequality, division. I mean, you started having the scientific, they're always, when I said that racial differences didn't start, people were dark skinned up until 8,000 to 12,000 years ago. That is the case. But when we started having what is called eugenics, the science of racism, which was developed at University College London in the 19th century, in the mid-19th, 1800s, that's when we started having that, people trying to put bogus, insulting, racist views of the differences between the races. So that's when eugenics started in the second half of the 19th century, to try to put flesh, as they saw it, on a bone which had already existed. Because, of course, the transatlantic slave trade started in the early 1500s by the Portuguese and Spanish. And then the English were the ones who came in after that, and in the 1500s. And then other European nations followed in the 1600s. And the basic premise of chattel slavery, whereby you sell human beings, was based on a dehumanization of the African. They were seen as subhuman. You could do that. You could pack them in as though they weren't human at all. So if you want to call that racism, that existed as long ago as that. The first Europeans went into Africa in the 1400s, thereabouts, in substantial numbers. And there were even examples as early as 1444 of enslaved Africans being taken from what we would call Lagos in Nigeria today. Of course, Lagos comes from the Portuguese word Lagos, meaning lagoon. So it goes back some centuries. Was there another question?
No. But we still have a couple of more questions coming your way. Just one quick one. Do you eat fish, Zeinab?
I do eat fish, actually. Joseph, I do. But I don't. I eat fish and chips. I don't like fish if it's too slimy. So maybe I'm a little bit like my brother, but my brother is so yuck. I don't eat raw fish, but so yes, it's interesting.
Okay, all right. Let me get more questions from the audience. The first one: where and when did people start living in settlements of more than 10,000? And the second one, having covered the history of Africa from the pre-colonial era to independence, what area or areas of this history would you encourage those considering a PhD in African history to pursue? And then the third one, why do we have so little written on Africa? Perhaps you could combine it with the fourth one. Was Africa traditional patriarchal or matriarchal?
Right. Well, there are quite a few there. So,
yeah.
When we started living in so about 10,000 years ago, we started farming. So I don't know about settlements of 10,000. There would be much smaller, the settlements then. But we started farming about 9,000 years ago. And that's when people became settled. And that is really when, that accounts for 1% of human history when we became settled people. And I don't know when 10,000, I suppose you would say the ancient Egyptians would have been some of the earliest people to have lived in settlements that large. Because we have lived as hunter-gatherers for nearly all of our existence. It's only the last 1%, the past 12,000 years, that we've experienced the most dramatic change. So I would say, I think I would say between maybe 7,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, we became farmers and pastoralists. So that's when we started forming settlements, and then we started forming kingdoms. So that's in my first chapter that we looked at that. Then you had the question about
whether Africa has always been patriarchal or matriarchal.
So when we say all of Africa, of course, it's not all of Africa is the same, but I would say that there are parts of Africa, particularly in the West, like the Asante people, who have had a matriarchal system of inheritance. There were even queens at one time, and then they changed and they had male rulers. And that's partly because the men were better fighters. And so they thought, hang on, it's better to have a king. But they always kept and still keep, a matriarchal system of hereditary. So who your mother is very, very important for the Asante people. And even today, if there's a birth in the Asante community, somebody will say, oh, was it a boy or a girl? And they'll say, oh, a girl, how fantastic. They really, really are pleased that a girl has been born. And other cultures in Africa, like the Kushites, it wouldn't be the ancient Egyptians, a son would inherit from his father, the king. But with the ancient Kushites, it could be from the son of the king's sister. So who your mother was very, very important. And queens could rule with their sons as co-regents, or they could rule with their husbands as a as a king and a queen. And in fact, there are examples. I give you just one of Queen Amani Renance in 30 BCE, a Kushite queen who led her people into battle against the Romans, because by then the Romans had conquered Egypt and were governing it there, and they would set their sights on northern Sudan. She actually led her people into battle and forced the Romans to sign a treaty with her in 22 BCE. She lost one eye in the battle, so she was known as the one-eyed queen, Amani Renance. And these queens were known as Kandakas. And when the revolution in 2019 in Sudan happened and they brought down Omar al-Bashir, a lot of young women were in the vanguard of those protests, and they styled themselves as Kandakas, reaching into history to say, we are strong queens, as it were, with demonstrations and our protests. So I would say you can't say, all of Africa was matriarchal, but certainly who your mother was in many instances was very, very important. And you could have women chiefs even. This idea that African women are downtrodden wretches in history or today is just not borne out by that. And then you asked a question about why there's little written history of Africa. So, Africa didn't always write. There were some places where, I say countries, but the countries were all formed for the most part in the late 19th century. There were some countries like Egypt and Abyssinia or Ethiopia that sort of did exist, but for the most part, the peoples of Africa didn't always have a written language. There was an Ethiopian script in the 3rd century, But a lot of Africans who became Muslim learned how to read and write Arabic. So, for example, at the Library of Timbuktu in Mali, you've got a massive African literature, science, law, the sciences, humanities, everything African written in Arabic. But this idea that just because Africa didn't always write, that it didn't record its history is, in my view, mistaken, because and this is where the African historians are really quite different from the Western historians who say, oh, it's not written. We're going to use the sources written by, European chroniclers, colonial officers, explorers, missionaries, which is why they often don't give you the full picture or even sometimes give you a slanted picture. The African historians often draw on oral tradition. So just because Africa didn't always write didn't mean it didn't record its history. You just have to get at it in a different way. Archaeology tells you a lot. Oral tradition tells you a lot. Music, dance, songs. So, you build a more complete, authentic picture of Africa's history if you don't just rely on written sources. So I would say that you've got to look at these non-written sources, what written sources there are, and also the kind of written sources that the Europeans didn't always look at, the Arab, chroniclers, the Persians, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There are a couple of more questions. I hope we still have time. What was the dominant religion in North Africa before Islam and Christianity? That's one of the questions. The other one was, if Europe had a renaissance in the 15th and the 16th centuries, when do you consider Africa to have had a similar kind of, renaissance? And then knowing the complexity associated with diversity in Africa, how can this diversity lead to positivity and success?
The dominant religion in North Africa before Islam and Christianity, there were some Jews. The Jews went to North Africa after the destruction of the first destruction of the Jewish temple in Babylon, Jerusalem. So there were Jews. There were Jews in North Africa, quite a substantial number. And so that's one thing. But the indigenous people of North Africa were what we call the Berber or the Amazigh, as they prefer to call themselves. The Amazigh meaning noble, free people. And they were pagans, essentially, before some of them became Jews, some of them became Muslims, some of them became Christians, and some of them became Muslims in that order. But they were, for the most part, pagans. And often you could find people who had parents, one and the other. And I'm thinking of St. Augustine, who's one of the greatest thinkers in Christianity, who was born in Hippo, which is the modern Algerian city of Annaba. And his father was probably, we're not sure, but probably a pagan Berber, and his mother was a Christian. So that's who the people were. The original inhabitants of North Africa were the Ibero-Mauritanians, and then the Capsians, and then they became the people of the Berber Amazigh people. A renaissance for Africa. I mean, I think that if you look at the North African dynasties, the Almoravids, the Almohads, and so on. I mean, these were centers of great learning. The city of Fez in Morocco today had a university from the 9th century, the oldest university ever established in the 800s. And, these were places which were a magnet for thinkers and so on. And of course, the North African dynasties conquered extensive parts of Europe, and they were, inspirations, in fact, for the later European Renaissance. So that would be one aspect. But I don't think you can talk about the continent as one kind of big monolith. I think at the time of Mansa Musa, Timbuktu was a very, very important center of learning. For sure, that would have been in the 13th, 14th, even the Songhai kingdom, which came after the Mali Empire. Actually, that was the heyday of Timbuktu. So, from the 13th to the 16th century, Timbuktu was a place of great learning because the rulers, interacted with people in North Africa. They would have teachers come there. They set up mosques, which were centers of great learning. So I would also say in West Africa around that time, 13th and 16th centuries. What was the other question? Oh, the diversity.
Yes.
I mean, yes. I think the idea, Africa is the most diverse continent in the world. And that is a fact. And I think that for me, there is unity in diversity because although people have had very different histories, obviously, I think there is one unifying factor for Africa, and that is that the whole of the continent, even Ethiopia, which nominally stayed independent, was occupied by the Italians during the Second World War, and they had many battles with the Brits and the Italians. Liberia, which is often cited as a country that wasn't colonized well, corporate interests were very, very strong in Liberia and really compromised its sovereignty. So I would say the whole continent has been a unity forged by having to fight foreign invaders. And I would say that unity, I would like to see a revival of Pan-Africanism. It doesn't really exist in any robust way today. I hope it's a light sleeper, but, that great sort of Pan-African move that we saw in that period, particularly after the decolonization of many countries, independence in the 60s, Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, finding an Egyptian wife for Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana in a spirit of Pan-Africanism. I would like to say that, look, you've got this shared history from this shared suffering and to try to unite. And that's why I think when Mandela was released in 1990, one of the first countries he visited was far in the north of the continent. He went all the way to Algeria to thank them for their support during the struggle against apartheid. And I think that's quite symbolic of the fact that there is diversity, but there is also unity forged from a kind of shared suffering.
Thank you very much. I think this is the very last one, and I think it will allow you really to summarize the talk. How does an African history of Africa differ from other forms of African history?
I think I sort of said that at the beginning. I think that, there have been some attempts, but I feel that I have given a relatively comprehensive, there's no part of Africa that's overlooked, north, south, east, west, central. And I've tried to look at some of the great moments in history of each of these regions, which are also supported by perhaps visual evidence like Great Zimbabwe and so on, so that it's living, people can go and visit these things. And I would say, again, it's written in, I hope, a very accessible, conversational style. There are a lot of facts in it, but I think most of all, as I say, it's not me, it's not my opinion as such, Zeinab Badawi, who's written this book. I think it's different because I've brought the African historian, the African academic to the fore by providing them with a platform and really, I think, according them the respect and the dignity of telling their own history. And saying to people, look, Africa has a history, has institutions, has traditions that are worthy of respect and study and of being propagated by the people themselves.
Thank you very much, Zeinab. Thank you so much for giving us such a fascinating talk and obviously for your book that is really thought-provoking, that, spare us to think more critically about our approaches to African history and our approaches to sources and our approaches to, the African geography. Thank you so much. Just a reminder that the recording of this event will be available on the Festival's York Ideas YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section. And if you'd like to purchase a copy of Zeinab's book, An African History of Africa, it will be available on foxlanebooks.co.uk. Thank you so much, Zeinab. Just to let you know that I live just a few hundred meters from Great Zimbabwe, and and my wife worked at Great Zimbabwe for quite some time, so it's really something that is very close to our heart. And of course, also that I was taught by Verbandoro that you mentioned in your talk. Yes, he was one of my undergraduate lecturers. Yeah.
Amazing, wonderful man. You're very lucky.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to you, Joseph, for handling this so magnificently. And thank you to everybody who's been listening and for your very thoughtful questions. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you.